get started. We'll just keep admitting people as they trickle in. But welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is part one of a two-part series about writing better code. So today we'll have three speakers that will tell us about general principles for writing better code, reproducible workflows, and using GitHub to make that all work in the grand scheme of things. So on the webinar, we'll focus on listening and learning, basically. So each of the three talks will be about 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. We'll be recording this meeting just like the other ones, so that the people that cannot be with us here today can check it out afterwards. So with that, I think I will, it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Graham from the University of Birmingham. She's one of the people who has been involved in writing the BES guide for reproducible code. And she will tell us a bit about general principles for writing good code. And I guess take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm just trying to find the thing. Okay, can you see my slides okay there?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this talk is one that I've given a couple of times. It's largely based on a lot of what is in the BES guide to better code. A lot of it is kind of my own sort of personal opinions and sort of practices that I've picked up along the way, both through research and through trial and error and things like that. So that's just a caveat that it is quite subjective. I think that's the right word. Okay, so first of all, why do we need sort of this best practice? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, firstly, coding style, thinking about effective comments on your code, using functions in your code, and this is going to, I think, be important for the talk later on the targets package. Something around defensive programming, which I'll explain when we get there, and folder organization, using our projects for kind of clearer, more concise, sort of contained ways of working. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about R Markdown for kind of integrating your workflow with your text. So firstly, why do we really want to worry about best practice? And I think this tweet kind of sums it up for me. It's basically your closest collaborator is you from 6 months ago, but you no longer answer emails. So by following best practice now, you're being kind to your future self. So it makes it easier to revisit a project a few months down the line. It's easier for others to understand what you've done. And if you're developing code that you want to be used by others, it actually increases the chances they will actually use it. So I think one of the things to get sort of like what I view as sort of better looking code is to develop a consistent and neat coding style. So there are a bunch of style guides out there, but really the key to this is to choose a logical and readable coding style and then stick to it. There's a tidyverse style guide, and I'll share these slides so you can have the link to that. But yeah, as I said, the key to it is consistency. So you're going to want to think about things like having meaningful file names, and that can immediately improve the logical consistency of your project. So a good example would be you've got some numbered files and they say exactly what the analysis is doing. And then a sort of not so great example given here, which to be honest, quite a lot of mine look like that, test script, nonsense like that. And the next thing I'd say is to have some concise and descriptive object names. So essentially, you're going to want to be able to read through your code and really see sort of what it's doing. So any variables should kind of tell you what's being held in that variable, and any functions should tell you what they do. So you'd want to give a noun to a variable, and function names should generally be verbs. And also avoid using names of existing objects like the inbuilt R functions. And this is something I learned the hard way when I wrote a Shannon diversity function and called it SD, which is the standard deviation calculation. Okay, so for example here, I've got 3 objects. I've got species stat, which holds the species data, land cover shape, which holds a land cover shape file, land cover ras holds a land cover raster, and then a function, calc species richness. So they all kind of, you know what's going on there. Some bad examples there. Shapefile of what? My function, what does the function do? And then the next thing is around readability. So spacing should be used to improve the visual effect. So use spaces much like you would in a sentence, really. Indentation generally with spaces and not tabs, and not a mixture of the two. And then use consistent cases in your name. So you could go all lowercase. I tend to go for the underscore separated, and then there's sort of these 2 different camel case. And like I said, it's kind of work out what works for you, what you prefer the look of, and then stick to it. Okay, so the next bit I'm going to talk about is effective comments in your code. So comments in code is a line of code that's visible but not read by the computer, signified in R with the what's it called, the hash sign, pound sign. And generally it should be used to comment the why rather than the what. So don't know where the example's gone there, sorry about that. So a good example here is we've got a list of grid cells, and the comment's telling me why I've got a list of grid cells, and it's because I need it for the for loop. And then for the for loop, it's just sort of saying for each grid cell we want to calculate the species richness. Bad would be something like this, setting x equals to 1. It's kind of like a wasted code, a wasted comment there, really, because we can see that that's what's happening. I find comments can also be really useful to break the script up into sections. And if you do it like this with, you could either have these hash signs at the end, or you can have hyphens at the end. If you do that in RStudio, it actually creates sections so you can kind of navigate between them. And I tend to use comments as pseudocode, and this helps me plan out a long script. So you kind of write out exactly what you want to do throughout the script in plain text as comments, and it lets you think about the control flow of your work. Then you kind of fill in with the actual code. And the benefit of this is that you've got well commented code at the end without having to add it afterwards. Right, okay, so the next bit's around using functions. So firstly, what are the functions? So it's a self-contained block of code that performs one single action. And R has lots of inbuilt functions that I'm sure everyone using R uses these all the time. So mean, standard deviation. And you use them like this. So the name of the function with the brackets, calculate it like that. And if we actually dig around in our source files, we can find the code that's been written for these functions in a lot of cases. So why do we want to use these in nice code? So one reason is repeating analysis multiple times with different parameters. You avoid the error that can be introduced by copying and pasting. For example, if you decide you need to change part of the way the code works, if you've copied and pasted it, you have to repeat those changes for every block. Another reason is that it provides better structure by modularizing your code, which in turn makes it a lot more readable. So for example, here, we've got functions to import data, format data, filter data, and then calculate species richness, which is going to be a lot more readable than if we had all of the code that does these in the main script. So to write a function, hi, am I back? Can you still see my slides? Sorry, everything went a bit confusing.
No, you're here.
Okay, now that's gone weird. Okay, sorry about that. So to write a function, we give it a name. So like I said, give it a verb. So what we're doing here is we're squaring a number. So I've called it square number. Assign it to the function with the parameters inside of the round brackets. And then in the curly brackets, it's you put all the stuff that you need to calculate. And as best practice, I tend to always put at the end of the function this return command with the object I want to return. You don't have to do this in R. R is quite a weird programming language for that, because most programming languages, you do have to do it. But you can end up getting into trouble if the last line in your function is, for example, adding a column to the data. It will only return that column, for example. So I always put the return statement at the end. And then you call it like you would any other function, as I showed before. So square number 5, get 25. Functions should be defined before they are called in the script. I would say good practice is to save in an external script and then import that external script at the beginning of analysis after loading the R packages. And this just means that your main script file is quite tidy and all of the sort of like little details are hidden in the background. And something that goes along well with functions is this idea of defensive programming. And what this does is it ensures that your code fails fast and with well-defined errors. It creates a little bit more work, but it saves a lot of time when you're debugging code or running code. And it amounts to just adding some checks into your code, like print statements to show where it's got to, checking for data types and things like that. So if we add defensive programming into our function, so firstly, what happens if we try to square a string, so an unexpected input? So you get this kind of meaningless message, which can be quite hard to look at, but also if our function had taken a really long time and then it errors right near the end, that would be really annoying. So it's good to add this defensive programming at the beginning. So what I've done here is I've got a line at the beginning saying if the input, the base, is not numeric, then stop the code there and return an error message. And we get this error message, error in square number, please ensure base is numeric. But then if we run it with a numeric in there, it works still, and we don't get any kind of printout or anything. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about folder organization. This is one of the things that I think is really subjective, so it's a case of working out what works for you. But for me, what I tend to do is I'll have a folder for code, a folder for data, the folders for outputs, so figures and results. And then my main scripts tend to be in the front of there. So I've got main, which would be the kind of paper quite often, and process data, which would be sort of a long-running script that goes into that. But yeah, like I say, choose something that works for you, and also try to keep raw data separate from process data. I'm going to say something about relative and absolute paths, because I think this could be quite useful to understand. So the absolute path is the full path to a file. So starting with the drive. And then a relative path is the path relative to the current working directory. So assuming this is my working directory, the relative path would be this code/functions. So current working directory plus relative path is the absolute path. We can find this in R using getwd. And the reason I think this is quite important for best practice is that relative paths make code more portable. So it means you can move between computers without having to change paths. You can share code with colleagues because they're not going to have the same sort of folder structure as you. But But I will say that absolute paths can be useful too. For example, if data is stored outside the project folder. Okay. So quick bit about our projects. And this is kind of less about coding, more about organization. But generally, it's the idea is one project has one folder, and it's self-contained, and it has its own workspace and its own history. With our projects, you can automatically set up version control, which I believe the next talk is going to be talking about version control. There's a guide to using our projects here. So like I said, I'll share the slides and you'll have these links. And then the last thing to talk about is our Markdown. And this is where you can kind of combine your code and your text all together into a kind of reproducible workflow. So it keeps your analysis and writing together. You can integrate code chunks in R with plain text in Markdown format. And kind of recent developments are allowing you to use other coding languages within an R Markdown document. So if your underlying data change for a report or for a paper or something like this, you can just rerun the R Markdown report and all the figures, tables and embedded values will change. It's great for using for reports. Some people use it for manuscripts. I tend not to. I find it really useful for supplementary materials for manuscripts though. And it also allows you to record your computational analysis in the same way as you would with like lab or field notebooks. And there's a guide to our Markdown there. So just to finish off, an important note, don't feel like you have to do all of this. Work out the bits that are most important for you and the kind of work you do and build it all up over time. It's kind of getting to this sort of best practices, really sort of like it's a incremental continuous process. And then a couple of additional resources here. So a guide to reproducible code in ecology and evolution, which was mentioned earlier, and then also Hadley Wickham's R for Data Science book. I think it's Hadley Wickham's, sorry, I didn't check. These are both great guides for sort of really getting into the sort of nitty-gritty of best practice. Okay, and that's me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. That was fantastic. Like I definitely have some improvements to make. Does anyone have any questions for Laura about anything related to this or not related, I guess? So if you have questions, just raise your hand and there we go. Alan.
Yeah. Hi, Laura. Thanks for a great talk. I just have one small question about defensive programming. Do you have any good sources to read up on that? Because that's something I should learn more about from my functions, I see.
Yeah, so I believe in that for data analysis book, there's a section about defensive programming, but if not, I can dig out something and share it. And then the other thing to mention is there's a package called Test This, and it allows you to add tests into your workflow. And I think the tutorials to go along with that really kind of talk about those kind of things, I think. But yeah, I'll dig out some sources for you because I definitely think it's really useful, because the amount of times I do a lot of spatial stuff, and the amount of times I've got to the end of a really long analysis and I've made some stupid error with the input and it just all fails is, yeah, it's embarrassing how often that happens.
Yeah, I know. Thanks, that I know where to start.
I also have one question. I'm pretty sure Aud and some others of my colleagues would tell me use targets and that will fix this one. But so I've been starting to use more R Markdown, but I often have kind of workflows that contain 1 or 2 steps that take a lot of time to run. And it's like I keep trying to find ways to disable parts of the R Markdowns so it doesn't rerun everything, but it's not consistent. And I was wondering if you have any like tips or opinion on how to work with R markdowns when some parts can take really long to run, and you may not want to rerun them every time you want to recompile the R markdown?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. So one of them, you'll have noticed in that folder structure, I had two separate R markdowns. One of them was processing the data, and one of them was kind of running the more kind of light analysis and making figures and things like that. And the reason I do that is because of that, because I don't want to run the data processing every time I run the markdown. But there is, if you do want to include it all in the same document, there is a cache argument within the code chunks. And if you set cache equals to true, just make sure you never change anything in that chunk. But the thing to note is that if you have a setup chunk at the beginning of your document, if anything changes in there, then cached code runs again. Okay. This took me ages to figure out. So if you call a chunk setup, and I tend to do that with the libraries. So when I'm loading all the different R packages, if you then add a new R package in there, then the entire document will rerun whether you've cached it or not. But yeah, those are the two different ways I'd say to deal with that.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to move on. If anybody suddenly gets a burning question for Laura, just drop that into the chat and we'll take it from there. But now I think I will give the word to Aud. Aud, excuse me, it's just because you've been here before. Aud from the University of Bergen, who is doing a lot of work related to open science practices and teaching open science practices as well.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. I guess you let me know if something goes wrong. I'm going to talk about the targets package, which is a pipeline tool for statistical analysis and data science in R. And it's actually great that it follows the talk by Laura, because she has introduced a lot of important things that I don't need to define anymore. So I guess if you follow all the things that Laura says, then you're halfway there to reproducibility. And then target will kind of help you with some other issues. And I think your question, Chloe, also was perfectly introduces the target package, because my answer would really have been use target, because that's one of the main points about target. Yeah, so I hope I'll be able to explain a bit better why target is so useful. So it's this pipeline tool, and it really enables reproducibility in your workflows, and it avoids repeating that you run code repeatedly. So if you update a little thing, you don't have to update all of the code over and over again. It just updates whatever is needed, and that is really useful when you have very code that takes a long time to run, because it just updates whatever is needed, and everything that is already up to date doesn't have to run again. And maybe it becomes a little bit more clear when I show you a very minimal workflow or pipeline. So when is target very useful? As I said, when you have code that runs very slowly or is very complex, and it's all like I don't run so much code that takes days or weeks to run, but even if you have an analysis that takes a couple of minutes to run, I already get annoyed when you have to rerun it again and again. And when you're building your code and working on an analysis, you kind of build it slowly, and you add little bits and parts and change it and adapt it and so on. And then you usually have to run it a couple of times. And Target really helps you to make sure that things are up to date, and you only have to run the parts that need to be run. Target is also very useful when you have interconnected tasks with dependencies. So if you look at the figure below the text here, you see one of those pipelines that is built on different steps that depend on each other. So you import some data, maybe you have to tidy the data a bit, then you have a transformed data object or a clean data object. You run a model on it, and then you get some results or something. And if you update your model, all the steps that come afterwards are out of sync, so you have to run them again. And Target helps you to figure out, so you don't have to remember which parts, how your pipeline works. Target kind of takes care of which steps comes after the modeling part, and just updates those. So you don't have to import the data again or tidy them again and things like that. Target is also built on that you use functions. So as you have heard, it's useful to use functions, and Target really encourages or uses, is based on that you are using functions for coding. And another thing about Target is if you have different output formats. So Target is also built on that you're using Markdown or other versions of writing or making different ways of or different output formats, using different output formats. And so you can imagine you use some data and do some analysis, and then you write a paper. You might make a presentation or make some figures that you use over and over again, and you really don't want to duplicate or have the same code in different places, because if you want to change something on the figure, you have to remember where you had all the different versions of the code to produce this figure. And so it's much better to just have one place where you produce the figure, and then use the figure as an object in your report, in your paper, in your presentation. And Target helps with that. So how does it work? Target has a very defined file structure, which you can see here. So you have data. This can be just one data file, or it can be a folder with different data sets. Usually you don't have just one data file. Then you often have a folder with your code. It can be called R or code or whatever. And in there you have your R scripts, and those can be functions or other R scripts. And then the last thing is this _targets.r file. And this is the file that configures and defines your pipeline. So here below in this figure, you can see a very minimal example of such a pipeline. So first, there is the raw data file. The file is imported. Then the data is cleaned, and then you do some run a little model with it, make a figure, and then also make a report. And then this create plot, this triangle shows that this is a function that is used to create this plot. And in your target script, you kind of define where the data comes from and how it is connected each step along this pipeline. So in this target script, you first load your packages and functions, and then you define the pipeline. And I want to show you all of this in R because I think it's a little bit abstract, so it's maybe easier to see that in R itself. Note that my windows are a bit switched from the usual place that you probably have your code, so but I kind of forgot where people have the windows or how it is normally, so this is just how I have it. So down here you see.
Can you maybe zoom it in 1 or 2?
Yeah, probably. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Great. So here you have your file structure, and what you can see here is the folder with the data. So here is this raw data file. You have the R folder with a script with your functions, and here I have opened the script. So there's a bit of information up here, but the important thing is here you have a function that creates a histogram. So very simple thing. And then here you have your target script. And the other thing I wanted to show you is that you also have a markdown script that creates your report. So here is the markdown script. It creates a HTML document, has some text, and then also loads a figure that you have produced. So it's again very minimalistic, but just to give you the general idea. So if you look at this target script, so that's the script that creates the pipeline or defines the pipeline. You can see that it loads some libraries at the beginning, and then it also sources all the functions that you use. So in this case, it's just one script. There are some other options that I don't want to go into now. And then here is like this list of the different targets that you make. And here I can show you again this visually, how the pipeline works. And you can see that like the first target that is defined is this raw data file. Then the next target that is defined is like importing the raw data, tidying the data, making the histogram. And here you can see that the function create plot is used to make this histogram. Then a model is run, and then the R markdown file is created. And this is now like a small list of these different targets, but you can make this as big and complicated as you want. Before you like start your pipeline, you can use this command tar manifest and then just check if like everything that you have defined is there. So all the targets are there and the functions are the right ones. And then to actually run the pipeline, you use the function tar make. And this will take a minute. So I have already run this plan before. So it shows me that all the targets, it's skipping all the steps because everything is already up to date. And then you can also use this tar vis network function to create this visualization. And that's quite useful. If something goes wrong, it will show you what is not up to date and how things are connected. So of course, in this example, it's very easy, but if it gets more complicated, this is very nice to look at. So what happens if you change anything in your code? So for example, we could change the model that we are running. So we want to have an interaction in the model. We change the code, save the script, and then just run the the pipeline again, and now you can see that it made the target fit again, and then it says the target fit is built, but all the other steps are not touched because they are not affected by changing the model. So of course, if I will change something in the histogram, then both the histogram and the report would have to be updated. Or if I change the function or something like that. Yeah, and here this is the output of the report. So here you can it's a HTML document, and here you can see the sentence that was there and then the plot that is made. And maybe another thing that I have maybe not explained yet, but like all of these targets, it's not the pipeline doesn't create them because they're already there, and they're also always available. So you can just use tar load and then say which of the targets you want to load, and then you can plot it and it will be there. So all the targets that you have created, they are always stored in the cache and they are always available. So that's the so you don't have to create them every time again and again. So with this, I just want to show you, like, this black box here shows you the first time you run the tar make, it builds like all the targets that you have created or from your pipeline. So I took a screenshot because I wanted to show you how it looks like. And as you saw now, it didn't create any of them because all of them were up to date. And here on the right side, you can see a pipeline that I'm working on for another project. So it can be really complicated, and you can have a lot of targets and functions, and they can be connected in many different ways. So this is just to show you that things can be a bit more complicated than this minimal example that I showed. And so with that, I have some links for further reading and watching. So this GitHub page from the target package is really useful. I've also used a lot of information from there for this talk. There's information and also videos that you can watch. There's a whole book, a user manual about targets, which is really good and will tell you a lot more about different options that targets has. If you're interested to getting started with target, like here, you can find this minimal example that I showed you. So you can download that or fork it and use it directly, and you just have to load or install and load all the packages, and then it should work. And here is a larger example that is a little bit more complex that Richard Telford has created, which gives you a bit more of an idea how you can use target in like a more complex setting. Yeah, so this, I'm done.
Thanks a lot, Aud. Now it's starting to feel like I could actually try it. Seems a bit less scary now. Do we have any questions about targets?
Still too complicated.
No, we have a question from Sandra.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting. I was wondering, how is it with debugging? You know, like you show this really complex network, and if there's some part of the code that is just not working, so how do we get information from this in Target?
Yeah. So the thing is, I don't make this big network all at once. So I slowly build it and just run, like every bit of code I add, I run. And then if it doesn't work, then I know at least where the problem is and try to figure out. And yeah, I'm not so sure, but usually you get information that tells you what went wrong, and then yeah, it's not so complicated to figure it out. Not sure how to explain.
Do you get the like you see the nodes in your like diagram, which is quite neat to see visually? So can you make it appear on that on that graph as well, that there's kind of a red dot somewhere that this is the node that is not working or something, or is it in the when you do the make and then you will see that one node didn't work and that's where you have to look?
Yeah, both. Like you can, like if you use the tar make, then it will build all the objects or all the targets that are working, and then it stops when it comes to the one that isn't working. So you'll see it tell you this and this failed. So you know where the problem is, and usually it also tells you more like I don't know, if a filter went wrong. I think it will tell you, yeah, this column didn't exist or something like that.
It will report the messages that you get normally from the packages.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it does that for all functions, but at least for many, you see the error message. And then when you create this visualization, you will also see which parts are up to date and which not. So you also see it visually where things failed or didn't work. Yeah.
So that brings me a new question. So because then if not all the messages are arriving, maybe, so is your strategy that you build a node, for example, before, like you don't really put it in the whole targets, you kind of test it first, and then once you've seen that it works, you put it in, so you're sure that some issues won't be kind of masked by the process?
Yeah, exactly. Like it depends. Sometimes I put it directly in if I know things are going to work, or I expect things are going to work. And a lot of stuff I just have a script, untitled script where I test things, and yeah, because you can load all the objects that you create, and then you can run some code, test things.
Thanks so much.
But I think the trick is really to build things slowly and not do everything at once.
Good advice.
It's also good to, when you start a new project, to directly start with target or very early in the project, because it's of course more difficult if you add it later, if you already have a lot of code. But yeah.
Thank you.
So we have one more question. If it's a quick one, Florian, you can go. Otherwise, we take it at the end.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a longer one, but I was wondering about like package management. Does Target do that as well, or do you use other packages for that? Like because I often run into problems where people have different versions of packages. Some are still on like R3.6 and some on R4. So it's a bit, and I've started using RENF or R environments, or was just wondering what other people are doing for that problem.
Yeah, no, I don't think Target is doing that. I think for that we need something else that I have forgotten the name of.
I'm using RENF. Okay, but then that's something else. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so if we build bottom up, then we see when things go wrong as we go, but sometimes stuff breaks downstream, and when that happens, we quite like to have some version control so we can actually go back. And with that, I'm gonna just give that to Francesco now to tell us a bit more about version control and using Git. And as before, if questions pop up, just put them in the chat.
Yeah. So, hi everybody. I'm Francesco Frassinelli from Nina. I hope that you can see my presentation. And sorry, I will need to close you. Okay, done. Then I will talk briefly about Git and GitHub. This is not a course, it's just a brief introduction with some tips based also on what we have said previously. So what is Git? If we look on Wikipedia, we can find that Git is a software for tracking changes in any set of files, which is what Laura referred when she said version control. So tracking changes. So we have different versions, different revisions, and it's used for coordinating work. So we can have multiple authors. And they also support distributed non-linear workflows, which basically means that we can have different branches and do different changes. So we can have usually a master or main branch where we have our main project code that is meant maybe for to be shared with the public, and then we can have different branches that can be like my own personal branches or the branch where I develop a nice feature. So what happens is that from a common version, maybe some people can work independently and create different branches. So this is called branching. And then at the end, we want to merge these changes together and have a coherent final version. This is called merging. Sometimes things go very well. Sometimes we have conflicts, as some of you may have experienced with Git. So maybe we try to avoid having those kind of issues. So we are not avoid to have people working on the same file. But as you can see, we have on the left side and on the right side two different changes, and so the software is not able to automatically merge those changes together. So we need to provide some inputs. So we need to deal with that. And what should I store in Git? We are talking about not actually any set of files. I mean, it's better to have the source, which can be a source code or something that can be considered as a source, in the sense that we have a set of files, and from those files we derive our output, we derive our report, our numerical statistical output, for example. So we try to store the source. So just to have a better understanding about that, there are files that are better suited for Git, because Git works mostly on text data, also to compute the difference. So Python, R, Julia, plain text, R, Markdown, Jupyter, LaTeX configuration file are great, while binary large data like images or large CSV files or like optimized or minified code is not so great. And why it's not meant actually for storing PDF, even if we can store PDF there. But if we change just a comma inside a PDF, then Git will have to store the new version as a whole and not just the difference. So the Git repository can become pretty big and is not really optimized for that case. So if you have a PDF, maybe you have produced that PDF from a LaTeX file or R Markdown, maybe. So it's better to store the source and have some scripts that produce that kind of output, as I was saying. So rule of thumb, my suggestion is if you can open the file in Notepad, then it's perfect for Git because it has to be to some degree human readable. Then I wanted to briefly talk about why Git is important. So what can give it to us or to you? So better reproducibility for various reasons. One of those reasons is that we can refer to a specific version. So each revision has a unique identifier, which is called hash. So we can refer and say, yes, please install my library and use this very specific revision. The interesting thing is that this hash is automatically generated from and it's kind of identify that kind of point in time for the repository. So we know that the code will always be like that if we refer to that unique identifier, because that's unique. And we have history, which is great, even if you are working alone. To me, has been of a great help, because you can say, first of all, for example, who changed this line, which is done using git blame, which is not maybe such a nice command, but actually it's useful is not because we want to blame people. Sometimes I am the one blaming myself but it's useful because you can see which commit made a specific change in your code. And if the commit has a good commit message, or by looking at what the developer was doing, then you have a better understanding about why, and why maybe you wrote 1 year ago that change. And then you can also undo that change even after some years even. It's no problem for Git. Okay, we can have some conflicts, but you still retain the information. So you can say, okay, maybe this algorithm that looks so cool is not so fast. I prefer the old one. So you can undo a change with git revert and better collaboration. So we have Git has some primitives, some mechanisms, so we can propose our changes back to the main project or to the main branch, and ask like for feedback, and get some feedback, of course, and also other people can improve or request can improve the code that we wrote before merging, or request some improvement. What I like to do, like in my group in Nina, is always to ask to somebody to have a look at my code, and vice versa, because even if the other person maybe is not a highly skilled developer, let's say, it's still useful in order to have a sense about who is doing what and why, what's happening, and have a brief look. And it's also very useful to read someone else's code. And then what's GitHub then? So when I show you the brief description about Git that I found on Wikipedia, there was written not to be confused with GitHub. So what is GitHub? Git is the software, and GitHub is a service, one of the possible services. We are referring to github.com, like it's hosted. And so on top of GitHub provides some additional functionalities, such as simplified collaboration using forks. So we have, this is a screenshot, a screenshot from the GitHub website. So you can produce your own version, even of project that you don't cooperate with. So you can copy, like copying a folder basically, and make your own changes and then propose them back using creating a pull request. And you can do it online on a web interface, while Git initially was meant for hardcore developers that rely on mailing lists and sending patches by mail and those kind of things. And then you can also create pull requests or draft pull requests, because you are kind of signaling to your partners or colleagues or that you are working on that feature. So there is an effort going on, but it's not ready yet. So in this case, you can use a draft pull request. And then when you're ready and say, I like this code, then you can have a regular pull request and change it. But GitHub is also a huge software catalog. So actually, the miniature probably is pretty small, but this is like the dashboard for exploring a project in Git. Has changed recently. So Git will, almost like a social network, try to propose you something that you could be interested, because maybe if you work in R, then it will start to propose you something that is R related or related to your field, but you also have a search functionality like a search engine. And as there is plenty of code, you should look for it. Maybe it's not doing what you want, but there are some functions that you can take inspiration from. Then you can also watch some whatever repository you want to get some news, but you can also use star to say, I like this. I want to keep it in my favorite list, and you can also organize some lists. And then you can also follow people, and then I can see what my colleagues are doing, what's happening. Maybe I can figure out that a colleague of mine started a repository or started a new repository, and maybe I'm interested into that. And then at the end, what you have, which is something that got improved recently, are GitHub Actions. So you can implement continuous integration and continuous testing and even deployment. So you can have your script, and then you can run your script automatically for each single commit. Each time you do a pull request, each time you do a change, you can have some scripts that gets executed automatically and can produce a result like a test and run a test and say, okay, all the tests work fine, or even produce some artifacts. So maybe you want to produce a manuscript or some output, and then you can generate those files and download them as zip files at the end. And that's useful. And with respect to that, I will also like to give you a final suggestion, which is pre-commit. And that's an image that I found on the pre-commit hooks for the R language. So we have the first stage is always remember to do things well. So we have guides, we have books about proper coding and doing things correctly and styling. And then, okay, the next step can be use continuous integration to spot regression issues and such. And then you have pre-commit hooks. That means that each time we create a commit, so basically we save our work, we can execute some action automatically. And then those actions are called hooks. So we can have a hook that looks if we are adding a file that probably shouldn't be there, like maybe a 100 megabyte image should not be there, so it will warn us. Or but we can also use for check if the R code that we've written is actually compliant with respect to the R language, so it can be executed in R actually. And then we have this styler library that is one of the possible libraries to automatically format your code to make it consistent, which makes it very pleasant to read also for other people, because different people have different way to code. So in order not to have to think, I should not put this space after the parentheses or to indent code properly, you can use a styler. You can use the styler from RStudio or add it to pre-commit, so it will be executed each time. So those are like my few tips, but as we are running out of time, I will stop here, and maybe we can hear some. I can try to reply to some of your questions, maybe.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. That was great. So if we have any questions to Francesco about Git or GitHub, we can take one or two now, and then we'll wrap up with a teaser for the June event. Any questions? Questions with Git usually arise when trying to actually do it. At least I feel like it's a very learning and figuring out by doing kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. But there are plenty of guides also on GitHub about how to use Git properly and suggested software and such. But please try to create as many branches as you want, one for each feature, each idea that you want to further develop or explore, because Git is meant for that. So take advantage of that and try to keep your changes small to have many different commits with small changes, because then it's very easy to figure out what's happening and not just to take 1 week of work and then writing as commit message, oh yeah, some work, enter, and then and that's it. So try to maintain your changes readable also for others, but it's also a gift that you are making to yourself, actually. That's my experience. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. So thank you to all of our speakers for today. This has been really, really useful. At least I got lots of ideas for new things to try now. And we will be trying new things in June. So in mid-June, we will have a slightly different event than usual. We'll have like a teeny tiny mini workshop for 2 hours where we can actually try to put some of what we learned today into practice. So we'll work in smaller groups on some code to make it ready for publication, or make it neater, or maybe try out targets, or whatever you think you would like to try. And we really encourage you to bring along your own code if you have something that you feel comfortable bringing along. And if you're not 100% comfortable, then it's probably still fine. It's like we all are horrible when we code, but we can be horrible together. But if you have nothing, we will also prepare some hideous dummy code for you to work on and improve. So I hope that many will come for the mini workshop next month. And yeah, I guess that's us done for today. So thanks a lot, everybody, for coming, and thanks again to our speakers, and see you soon.